Hello, hello. Welcome to the Black Sheep live stream. We are here. We are ready to go. I am Salome Siboney, co-founder of the Black Sheep and artist, speaker, writer. And we're going to be doing a lot of speaking about the heavy times that we are living through. I've seen people say that this does not feel like an optimistic start to the new year that is 2025. And I get it. I feel the same way. I started off my new year with a death in my family. And a lot of people are starting off their new year with no homes in LA. And a lot of people have started off their new years with still no homes in Asheville, North Carolina. So there's a lot of bad shit going on. And I think that we have to find much more constructive ways to deal with all the bad news that we're taking in. Normally on this live stream on Fridays, I do the weekly white pill, where I round up good news from the week and go through that so that we spend time actually considering and integrating the good news that is happening. Because so often we read the headline, yes, that's great, good news, I'm glad they cured some disease, and then we just move on. And then we spend so much more time debating and analyzing the bad news. So naturally, our worldview then ends up more shaped by the bad things that happen in the world than by the good, very real things that also happen. And so the weekly white pill that I do on this live stream is my effort to dedicate time to actually thinking about the good things so that my worldview isn't just shaped by all the bad things that I see and comment on. But we're not going to do that this Friday because there's some real bad news going on. I feel in myself kind of deeply affected by the LA fires. And I think a lot of people feel disturbed by what they've seen. And they're right to feel that way because the LA fires are unprecedented. They're in the top 20 worst fires in California's entire history. So the impact that we feel from these fires, from watching this incredible footage of just mass destruction and thinking about all the loss that people are suffering, whether it's loss of home, loss of irreplaceable items like family photos and things like that, or loss of even life, whether it's your pets or people. It's very somber. And so I didn't want to do the weekly good news roundup, partly because I wasn't ready. I have myself been consuming a lot of bad news this week, but also partly because how do I explain this? It's not just that we need to pay attention to the good news. It's that we also need to have a constructive way of working through the bad news. Okay? And the way that you deal with the bad news that we see very regularly in our lives now is not just by focusing on the good news instead. This is something that I think people get wrong when they think that a call to focus on the good news is just an attempt to dismiss and not take seriously the bad news. We also need to have constructive ways of dealing with the bad news. And I realized how much we don't have this when I was on social media during these LA fires, because it became so obvious to me that a lot of people who actually aren't affected by the fires, right? I'm not actually affected by the fires. I lived in LA for over 2 years. I know a lot of people in LA. I know people who have been affected by the fires, and I have been places that I loved in LA that are now gone. So in some ways, I might be more affected than someone who really has no relationship to LA and doesn't know anybody there, but I'm still not personally losing anything in these fires. And yet, I still feel impacted by this bad news. And so I think a lot of people feel this way with many of the different disasters and the bad news, whether it's news about crime and violence or war or just stories of like personal suffering that make it to the news that we hear. It's like some one person that gets brutally murdered, and that becomes the focus of social media for the day in the discourse. These kind of things still impact us, whether or not we are personally impacted by them. And that's good. It would be kind of sociopathic to hear about someone being brutally murdered or some town going up in flames or people suffering incredible loss in some natural disaster that goes on for months and months and months without recourse, and to not be impacted by that. So it's good that we are impacted by these things. The problem is that, like never before, we are impacted by negative events in the world, in the whole world, despite us not having any connection to the place or the person. And that's because of technology. That's because of our ability to consume media and news about the entire world. And so it still has an impact on us, despite us not being personally impacted. And so as I was on social media, keeping up with the LA fire news, like just glued, I'm not happy to admit it, I'm not proud of it, but just doom scrolling, just glued to my screen because I couldn't believe the destruction. I couldn't believe the incredible amount of loss that I was seeing. It just shocked me and pulled me in again and again. Every time I would check my phone, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't stop looking at these updates because they're just surreal. And so I realized I'm not the only person that's feeling like this. Clearly, as someone that's not actually personally impacted by these fires and yet is still so impacted emotionally, there's something going on here. And there's probably a lot of other people that are feeling this, because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you look at an entire neighborhood being burned to the ground and feel something about that? That would be concerning. And so the next question then is, what are we doing with that? What happens when we take in these like real tragedies and feel impacted by them, but then move on very quickly in a way that doesn't really leave room for us to grieve at all, for us to think through what we're feeling? And this is what I am concerned about, because when people suffer a loss in person, so some people were saying that there was this sense of camaraderie among a lot of Los Angeles because they were in this together. It was this kind of event where there's something really bad going on and everybody feels more connected to their neighbor because of this bad thing that everybody's being affected by. And this is a really well documented effect of tragedy, like on a collective level, whether it's war or natural disaster. People come together more when there are these collective tragedies. And it makes sense that we would become more pro-social, more cooperative, more empathetic towards each other during shared tragedies, because it makes us more equipped to get through and overcome those tragedies. But that doesn't happen on social media. On the contrary, the opposite seems to happen on social media. If you start talking about whatever the tragedy is on social media, you will quickly find yourself in a debate. And that is the issue with grieving or lack of grieving on social media and going through these kind of tragedies that we hear about, like this bad news, is that there's really no function on social media for us to have that same in-person pro-social impact that we have when we go through bad things together in person. Instead, because of the way social media works, we are disconnected and become more disconnected during these kind of tragedies on social media. And so not only are you still witnessing this tragedy, still feeling these negative impacts, you're also now lacking the kind of evolutionary response that helps us to lean on each other to get through these things. On the contrary, you're thrust into an anti-evolutionary environment where people are lashing out at each other and spinning their wheels, trying to come up with narratives to push their preferred ideology as soon as possible, because on social media, talking and intellectualizing and just verbiage is generally how people express themselves. There's not a lot of other ways to do it, just by the way that the medium works. We have to talk to be present on social media. There is no just being together, just listening, that doesn't really happen there, because there's no physical in real time presence. And so even on this live stream, I can try to create more of an in-person effect because we're in here in real time. You and I am talking to you in real time. You are listening in real time. So it's a lot more personal. It's a lot more real and connected because of that. But even then, I'm not actually talking to you. I can't see what you're writing on the screen right now. And so there really is this added layer of distance. And that very much is kind of akin to the parasocial relationship. You feel like you have a connection with someone, but they don't actually have the same connection with you because they're not connecting with you. They're connecting with their audience. So there really is not a good way for us to gain the same kind of pro-social response that we naturally feel in emergencies, in tragedies, when it's on social media. On the contrary, I think what ends up happening is that people start bypassing the upsetting nature of whatever it is that they're engaging with, that they're consuming. So in the case of the fires, like it was pretty quickly that I noticed, gosh, it seems like there's a lot of debate around the fires right now. Like this shit just started happening and there's like this intense desire to immediately politicize it, immediately find a scapegoat, immediately like tie it into your preferred thing. Like Bernie Sanders, like the fires were raging along. Like this was not even 12 hours into the chaos and Bernie Sanders was already like, this is climate change. It's like, can we do an actual assessment on the situation first? Like, we don't even know what's going on. We don't know how the fires were started. We don't know how bad they're going to be because they're still going. We don't know the level of casualties. We don't know like all the different elements that could be impacting this situation, which now have come out, issues that are much more about human error, like lack of forest management, lack of water in the hydrants in some places, understaffed fire department, under budgeted fire department. Those things aren't climate change. And so we need time before we can start doing these kind of like, oh, I have the grand answer to why this tragedy happened. But we don't give ourselves time on social media because that's not how the medium works. Everybody wants to be the first to give their hot take. And if you aren't doing that, you're just sitting on the sidelines. It's not like someone's like, oh, look at that very high-minded, restrained individual who's not posting anything. No, you're just absent. So there becomes this pressure to participate, to be seen in the space. And especially if you are a person that is trying to grow your social media platform, which, I don't know, kind of feels like a lot of people are, even if they aren't actually like, oh, this is my business, this is my job. doesn't everybody still kind of care about follower count, kind of care about having popular or viral tweets? Because I think that the dopaminergic effect of that works on just about everybody. So you might not be overtly pursuing growing your platform, but you still kind of want to hit tweet. And so we have this confluence of really unusual incentives that now mesh with things like tragedy, things like widespread emergencies. And I think it's making us sick. I think it's making us insane. And so I wanted to talk today about how to not do that, how to not get sucked into these ways of bypassing the fact that you are witnessing something really upsetting. And if you are a healthy person, you are going to be upset by it. Now, you don't want to go down this route of just like bypassing the emotions around it and numbing yourself, which is what I kind of feel like is happening to people that use social media commentary as their way of thinking through, processing, and expressing themselves around whatever upsetting event they're focused on. Because while text writing is a form of self-expression, posting online is a different kind of writing. It's writing for an audience. It's often writing for engagement. And even if you're not doing those things, even if you're straight up I'm just expressing myself, I'm just saying what comes to mind, I feel very free in doing that, you're still dealing with other people's insane reactions. So I have, in the time that I was spending on social media, navigating the LA fire cultural discourse, I saw some just terrible behavior. It was people that were adamant that the only reason for these fires is climate change. And if you don't affirm that narrative, you are an enemy of the Klan and you are going to get verbally assaulted because of it. As if in the midst of a historic level tragedy, just berating the shit out of someone for not being a climate change activist is the morally righteous thing to do. When you put it like that, you can kind of see immediately how absurd it is to think that the thing you need to do is to police whether everybody is believing that climate change is the sole major factor for these fires while they are still ongoing in the first 12 hours. But that's the social media impact on how we deal with traumatic, upsetting events. It's like literally called, I think, grief policing. And there's a little bit of research on this idea that on social media, when there is some kind of tragic loss, whether it's a celebrity's life or some other thing like this, like the natural disasters, there's this phenomenon that happens by which people start policing the way others grieve. So it will be things like what I just described, where it was like, oh, well, you have to recognize that the reason for this loss is the one that I believe is the most important. And if you don't believe that, you're a bad person. I'm going to insult you. Or the way you grieve, whether you're posting pictures of someone. I've seen people say like, why is people posting pictures of a celebrity that died when they were young? We need to remember them when they're old too. They were alive when they were old too. As if like it's a huge injustice to reflect on the life of some like actor that you cared about by picking a photo of them when they were in the prime of their career. That's grief policing. That is this propensity to not focus on the actual loss, but to focus on the way other people are dealing with the loss. This shit is fucked. Let me just put it as blatantly as I can. It is some of the most unhealthy behavior that I have seen, because not only is it a kind of outlet for people to offload their frustration, their sadness, their fear onto other people in this negative, unhealthy, antagonistic way, it also robs people of their right to just express their grief around something, to express their beliefs around some traumatic, tragic event. So on every level, it really shouldn't be happening. But this is a thing. As more and more people spend more and more time on social media, and as we start to reach the inevitable point at which there is a substantial segment of the population who is addicted to social media, that is inevitable. That is something that you should be watching the horizon for, because if you use your phone as much as I do, you know that you can be quite restrained with it, and it's still this pull. And there's a lot of people that do not have the capacity to avoid that pull. And it just happens. It's really quite an addictive thing. And so we're going to get to a point where a good number of people are addicted to social media. And so it's going to be an unhealthy thing. It's not the same as using your phone, like, oh, I use it all the time, but like I'm doing something productive with it. Or, I'm just looking at pictures. It can become this pathological use where people are looking for outlets for their frustration. And I saw this. I saw this artist post about how she was certain that the fires, at least in some part, were started by tweakers, like cracked out, homeless type meth heads. And of course, that has now been found out to be, at least in some regard, true. There have been arsonists arrested in response to these fires. It's not that they have started all of them, but they were actually people who were starting some of these fires. But this woman just got absolutely dogpiled for a post that turned out to be very true, because people did not want to have any other narrative regarding these fires except it's climate change. And so I watched as this happened to her, and I was like, oh my God, these people are so full of hatred and resentment. And it's so clear that they're just looking for an outlet to offload onto, that it's almost kind of crazy that someone would lack the self-awareness to recognize what they're doing. As if it's like, are you really that mad at a single post online of some random person you don't know that you're going to dig through their art and start insulting it and like start a dog pile on it? These are the kind of things that people really lack self-awareness and self-control to pause and say, what the fuck am I doing with my life right now? There is a really upsetting national disaster going on where I'm seeing horrific footage of mass destruction. Maybe I'm a little upset. Maybe I can connect that being upset to my behavior at which I am lashing out viciously at a stranger on the internet while this tragedy is going on. But a lot of people don't have that ability to reflect in that way. And it's understandable. That takes a lot of maturity and a lot of self-awareness to do that. But nonetheless, what happens when we start to reach a place in our culture where more and more people are not actually processing the emotions, the grief, the anger, the sadness from these constant streams of bad news? What happens to that person? I mean, we can already see people lashing out at each other online during these things. And the worst part is sometimes they're lashing out at people that are actually in the tragedy. So there was this one instance where I can't remember what the guy's name was, something Wasserman. And some kind of like multi-millionaire real estate bro figure, which of course those are such easy to hate people. If you hate success and you are bitter, then that is your favorite kind of target, is some successful man. And so this guy posted like, is there any way that I can pay for private firefighters? My house is going to be burned down. I'll do anything like to pay. I'll pay anything, something like that. He got bullied offline, like deleted his post. I think deleted his Twitter or like locked it or something like that. And he did lose his home. The person actually lost his home, and now had to deal with a barrage of strangers who weren't dealing with their home being burned down for the most part, insulting and attacking him for trying to do anything that he could to save his home. It's like the kind of thing that you got to pause and reflect on, the fact that that is an actual thing that happened on social media. And these are the kind of things that I'm telling you start to clarify the difference between how we deal with tragedies in person and how we deal with them through social media. And this kind of situation where you're engaged in bullying a person who is actually in the tragedy just because you think it's unfair that they're rich enough to try to pay for private firefighters to save their home, that's an upside down world. That's where we've gone full circle from, I care about this tragedy so much that I'm going to bully the shit out of the people that are in it. Like, what is going on there? And so I will tell you what is going on. That is the opposite of the camaraderie that people feel when they are dealing with the tragedy in person. If you saw that man in person and he asked you, do you know if there's any way I could pay for private firefighters? My home is going to burn down. You would not start bullying him and saying, no, you stupid rich asshole, your home should burn down just like everyone's else. You think you're better than everybody, that you can use your money to pay for private firefighters? Like, no person in their right mind would say anything like that. On the contrary, you would see the grief, you would see the panic, you would see the sadness in this person, and you would be able to relate to them because you're in front of a real person. Unlike what happens on social media, where we are not in front of real people. We only see this 2D version of them. We see pixels on a screen and project all the rest of them that is missing onto them, what we think they're like. So rich guy asking to pay for private firefighters, what an asshole. He's probably somehow part of the problem. That's so unfair how the rich are always succeeding and the other people are the ones that lose their home, even though the guy lost his home. So that is the response that we have on social media, because it's so much of like a projection dynamic where you have so little information on the person that you're engaging with that you fill in all the blanks with your projection of what this person is to you. And that is so often much less generous than reality. It's so often the case that the things that people get just trampled on for saying on social media, if they were in a party with you and they said it, you would just be like, yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't think that's how it should be. Or I don't know. I think it's different. But yeah, I see your point. Like, totally diffused because we see a real human being in front of us and we're incentivized to be pro-social, to get along with people, to give them the benefit of the doubt, not to cause conflict and take the least generous interpretation of what they say, because then we would have to deal with the consequences of being a highly disagreeable person who starts conflict for the sake of starting conflict. And you probably get kicked out of the party pretty soon. But you don't get kicked out of the party on social media. And so what happens is these kind of situations where people just do the opposite of what normally happens to us in tragedy. They create more conflict. They start bullying people who are actually in the tragedy. And instead of doing the process of grief and recognizing, wow, I'm really upset by the footage I'm seeing of mass destruction or violence or war. I'm really angry about how this could happen. All these normal responses to tragedy, people just get online and immediately start fighting with someone. And that's the way that they deal with that unpleasant response to a tragedy. But here's the problem. That is not actually dealing with the response. And this is my concern, is that I think that in some regard, social media is becoming this strange outlet for people who have the least ability to manage their own emotions and now have this perfect playground by which they can turn other people into their punching bags. And what's dangerous about this is that the more you do something, the more you do something. And so these people really are harming themselves most of all, because these antisocial patterns of behavior that they're able to engage in on social media do not work offline. You will not have friends. You will get fired. You will not succeed. Your family will not want to be around you. You will have more conflict and more problems in your life if you act like an asshole in your life. And so why be practicing being that asshole on social media? There's this fallacy, this mistaken idea that you can just turn it off. Like, I'm going to spend hours on social media insulting people, losing my temper, being disingenuous, trying to paint the worst possible interpretation of other people's arguments and not considering what they're saying in good faith. And then I'm going to put my phone down and suddenly be this rational, friendly, understanding, charitable person in conversation with others. That's not how that works. Who you are on social media is going to influence who you are off of social media, particularly if you spend a lot of time on it. And so my concern is that we're not going through the proper process for dealing with our problems, our negative responses to national emergencies, local tragedies, things that we see on social media or on the news that upset us. If we're just getting on social media and lashing out at people or like debating for hours about something, I know it sounds really woo and lame, but you have to feel the emotions. You have to feel the sadness around the thing. You have to have that part of the experience to fully get through the experience and to actually learn from it. And here's the worst part is that I think when people bypass the emotional side of these tragedies that we see through the media and just go straight to the intellectualizing and the debating and the fighting and the whatever, you lose out on one of the important impacts you get from having the emotional process of sadness and grief over sad news, which is compassion. You get a lot of compassion from processing sad things. It helps you to understand more how other people might be suffering. It helps you to care more about that suffering. And I feel like we've really lost appreciation for what that does because compassion has been so misrepresented by some people on the left who just weaponize it as a way to bully people into never having a contradictory opinion, because they say, oh, that's not compassionate. If you say that maybe, I don't know, it's kind of bad that crazy homeless drug addicts are running around LA and potentially have started fires. Maybe we should be concerned about that. That's not compassionate. Well, it's not compassionate that a ton of people's homes burned down, so we have to have the hard conversation. And that actually is compassionate, because compassion isn't just being nice and saying nice things and not saying mean things, not hurting anybody's feeling. That's some Disneyland fake idea of compassion. Compassion is doing the right thing, doing the thing that is actually going to help people and that is empathetic. And sometimes that's the hard thing. Very often, that's the uncomfortable, hard thing. And so when we don't experience the sadness and the anger and like the emotions fully from taking in this kind of news about tragedies, but instead we just kind of run past it to like, oh, let me tell you what Newsom did. Oh, let me tell you how DEI did this. Or actually, it's only climate change and you should know why it's only climate change. Like, if you jump into that and you have not even taken a good solid moment to think, I'm so grateful that that is not happening to me. And I am so deeply saddened for all the people that that is happening to. I can't imagine losing every possession I own. I can't imagine losing precious family photos that I can never replace. I can't imagine the chaos and the long, hard path of trying to rebuild from nothing. If you don't go through that process of just empathizing with the tragic event and the people in it, you lose out on the ability to actually be compassionate. And okay, this is, it all starts to circle back, because who are the people that are bullying people on social media right now, who are some of them actually in and impacted by these fires? The people who have rushed to start narrativizing and intellectualizing and grief policing. Those are the ones that are bypassing the process of just feeling the emotions. Because the thing is, when you are more connected to that emotional side of things and you give yourself some time, and it's like, let me change the language around this a little bit, because so often language becomes this shortcut for us to decide what we don't want to listen to and what is and isn't relevant. And so if I'm like, we've got to make space for the sadness, or some people are just gonna be like, that's not for me. That's that woo-woo shit. I turn off. You're still a human being. You have sadness. So whether you make space for it, you recognize it, you simply feel it, or whatever it is, you have to contend with that emotional experience. You have emotions. Sorry if that's woo, but you have them. So you got to do something with them. Because if you don't, you see a lot of these kind of pathological ways to deal with them, which is, I'm upset about this tragedy, so I'm going to bully people online. Like, I am upset about my station in life, so I'm going to become a communist that resents everybody who's better than me and blames them for everything that's wrong with society and tries to tank my actual society, as opposed to looking at my life and saying, yeah, I'm kind of bitter about the hand I was dealt. So it is a very real thing to take responsibility for your emotional experience of life. It's kind of crazy. It's like, I think in some ways it is the real hardcore thing to do, which is to be like, damn, I can't just intellectualize myself out of this. There's something very like control seeking and protectionist around the self about pure intellectualism around deeply emotional events like mass tragedies. And it's that it allows you to bypass the messy, unpleasant emotional side of it. And when you have something like you're watching this historic fire burn down so many people's homes, and you're running right to like, let me tell you about how my ideology would have never let this happen. You are not engaging in the actual emotional side of this experience, which is in some ways way bigger, way deeper than the intellectual side. Because you know what? Like, a lot of us already know what the fuck happened. We know that LA's government is wildly incompetent. And when it comes to like the forest management things, that discussion has been ongoing for years. I know because I've seen it. I've seen the whole, like, they're not actually doing controlled burns and like this really should be done, but it's not being done because there's these long waits before people actually get to do it because they have to assess the land because of environmental concerns. And so they don't end up doing the burn because it takes too long. Like, that conversation has been happening for years and years. So a lot of these things are things that we know. So it's really the emotional side of this particular tragedy that is really unique. And so to bypass that is in some ways to really not actually engage with the full event that's happening. It's to cut yourself off from what's actually happening and to just return to your happy, comfortable place where you criticize the world from your ideological standpoint. Nothing changes. And I actually think this is very unhealthy for us because we have this odd position now where we watch tragedies unfold. We get constant updates. I mean, I was glued to my phone about this fire. And in some regards, I still am. Like, it's like a day later or something, and I'm still like in this sense of shock that something so devastating could happen to such a major city. And so these things are really impactful events. And because we're distanced from them, like, I'm not in LA, I'm just seeing pictures and videos and commentary. It feels like we don't have to do anything about it. Like, we're just like, okay, I've done my daily scrolling about this. Like, I'm updated, I've commented, I've seen, I know what's going on. All right, let me go do the rest of my life. Like, as if all we've done is check our email or something. I really don't think that's accurate to what the experience of getting this secondhand regular updates on a mass tragic event that you just are not directly impacted by. And so I think there's something like, I think often about how weird it is, like video, how weird video is, because for most of human history, if you saw a person, they were in front of you. If you saw a realistic representation of a person, it was because it was a person. There was no video like this. You would not see something like me unless I was in front of you. I mean, you've seen like the cave drawings. That's not AI, like that now we have these kind of like incredibly realistic but fake depictions of people. Forget that. We are nowhere ready to be able to think through what it is to look at a very accurate, almost indecipherably accurate picture of a human being that is not real. Like, it's not a human being. We're still at the like, damn, I can see a person on a screen there. Like, that's a person. So you're telling me that you can watch hours of coverage where you're seeing people crying and you're watching a fire burning and yet all these things. I'm fine. Okay, I did my scrolling. I'm going to go on and watch some TV. All good. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think that we, in some ways, just overload ourselves with so much information right now that we don't even realize how it makes us feel, because we're so overloaded and we're so kind of like busy and distracted, and we really don't do the part that's hard. So understandably, we don't actively like, oh boy, let me just sit here and be sad. Yeah, I get it. I understand why we don't do that. But throughout history, grief was a crucial part of the process of going through tragic events. And people didn't have to contend with, okay, but what if I'm seeing tragic events from afar? What if I'm watching live updates for days of people losing their homes, raging wildfires, poor little animals being engulfed in the flame, and people losing their lives and trying to protect their homes? What do I do now when I'm seeing all of that, but it's still not me that's impacted? It's still not around me. Do I have a funeral? Do I do a ritual? Like, none. We don't have any processes around this because it's totally new. So my concern is we're still experiencing this kind of negative emotional impact from witnessing and responding to emotionally these tragic events. But unlike the past, where if you had a tragic event happen, you had that kinship with people around you, you probably had some kind of ceremony or event or ritual or something where people came together to express their grief, their frustration, and lean on each other. We don't have that. We have the opposite. We have, oh, I'm so upset about this, I'm gonna go fight with people on social media about it. So you tell me what you think that is gonna do. Because I have the sense, more and more you hear people that are talking about like, oh, everybody seems rude. Feels like people are more on edge sometimes. And this kind of like sense that people are not doing as well, maybe. I don't know how accurate that is. That could be completely anecdotal and unbacked by any relevant data. But I've seen it too, and I've heard it from people who, they're in otherwise good positions in their life, but they still have this somewhat cynical outlook. Like, yeah, well, things are good for me, but things are bad, out there, everywhere else. Because they hear about all the bad shit that's happening. And so this kind of media environment where we are consuming all this bad news, and even though it doesn't impact us directly, it still impacts us. This has effects, and I don't think we know what they are yet. That's really the weird thing about social media and the media landscape that we're in now, is just, we don't know what any of this is going to do to us. We're at the very beginning of being able to say, hey, it looks like social media might cause depression in young girls. Anybody could have predicted that. Everything causes depression in young girls. Like, that's whatever the new technology it is, I will bet my money that it's going to cause depression in young girls. That's not rocket science, but it's proven. It's already proven with data. And so if that's the case, what else is going to happen? And as I said, what else will happen as more people spend more time on social media and more people get more of their information about the world through social media, which has many wonderful benefits. This is not an argument of like, everybody should go back to the shitty legacy media because it was just better than social media. Not at all. We have to learn to live with new technology. That's simply what it is. And so this live stream, this discussion is part of that. And so I want to talk a little bit about grief and how we might actually incorporate that into our lives, because again, I know it sounds kind of woo, but I really think that we're in a situation where the people who are going to be healthier and more capable of dealing with the media landscape that we're in are the people who are able to actually manage their emotional response to what they consume through social media. You can't be the person who spends a bunch of time fighting with people online and insulting people and arguing with people, particularly about like things that are upsetting you that have just happened, and not have it kind of decline your life quality a little bit. That's not a good life. And I don't say that from my mountain on high. I say that as someone who has spent time responding to stupid ass shitty comments. And then afterwards, I'm like, what do I get for that? All I did was tell this person that's wrong because of this, and this is so stupid, and da da da. You don't get anything from it except that like little moment of like, I told them. And that is so much less rewarding than many other things you could be doing with your time. But that is the world of social media. It sucks you in, and suddenly you're like, I gotta tell them. And then suddenly you find yourself like spending 30 minutes, an hour, just kind of like engaging with bad news and fighting with people and negative commentary. And then you start to wonder like, oh, I'm not happy today. I didn't have a good day. You didn't have a good experience on social media. Like, you spent time giving attention to negative things, and it's sticking with you. And so this is the thing. It's not an argument to like, oh, make sure you don't stay informed with the news. Like, if there's any negative news, turn it off. That's obviously not the case. There is an argument for not over consuming news for sure. I think that we are in a place where, is news addiction a thing? Does anybody know if news addiction is a thing? Because if it's not a thing, let me coin it. Let me be the first one to tell you that it is a thing. It is different from just social media addiction, because these are not people that are spending all their time on Pinterest. They are specifically addicted to the news. They want to know what's happening, what's next, what's going on in the world. There's something very enticing about the sense of security that comes from knowing. And news makes you feel like you know what's going on. But if you tune into my good news segment, you'll realize how often we actually don't know what's going on. We just know a lot of the bad things that are going on, but there are many good things that we have not heard of at all. And it's kind of incredible, because it'll be like fascinating good things like, oh, someone has potentially cured brain cancer, or like someone has found this incredible organism that can help us cut down on plastic pollution in a substantial way. And nobody knows about it because it's not a topic of heated debate on social media, and it's not covered as often by the news, which wants to get you glued to the screen. So they tell you, do you know what terrible thing we found out about? Tune in at 8. So what do? What I do for dealing with this kind of omnipresent tragedy, right? Because at this point, there's a tragedy going on every moment of the day, whether it's a war, whether it's simply mortality, that someone is dying somewhere, or it's some particularly gripping tragedy that's local. There's a tragedy going on at every moment of the day. And that's a hard thing for us to come to grips with. I think it's part of the odd position we are in now because of media, because we have the capacity to know what's going on in most of the world all of the time. And so what do you do with that information when it reveals that there's bad shit happening all the time? How do you go on living your life? particularly when it's gripping bad news, like some kind of terrorist attack, some kind of violent crime, some kind of natural disaster that seems to be even more of a disaster because of the human negligence element that makes it seem less like a random act of God and more like something that could have been prevented, which makes you more angry about it. What do you do? And I'm going to give you my approach to these things, which is I think that there's a way to come at tragedy from a place of respect, which means I don't immediately start debating it. I don't immediately start politicizing it. I don't immediately run to give my opinion on it. And this is actually really hard to do if you are a person that uses social media to express yourself, because that's what you're going to want to do. But let me just tell you that that practice has served me so well, maybe better than almost anything else I do with my social media usage, is waiting to comment on any kind of tragedy. And not out of like a cynical, oh, this is good for engagement, because it's not. It's absolutely not. It's the opposite. But it's good for your soul, okay? It's good for your spirit to show a kind of respect, which is I'm not going to immediately run to make this thing that is tragic and traumatic to many people about me, about my views on this, about how I feel about it. I'm going to give a kind of like moment of silence on social media, and you don't get anything for it. It's not like posting the black BLM square where you get to show it. You just do it. It's just a practice that you do as a way to have a healthy relationship with all the bad news we're going to continue hearing. And it's one of like humanizing these tragedies and respecting the people that are in them and finding compassion within yourself so that when you do speak about these things, when you do express yourself on these things, you're coming from at least a little more of a place of compassion and depth and self-control, as opposed to trying to suppress feelings, trying to simply distract yourself, trying to lash out at people and dump your anger or frustration or sadness on them through debate and discourse. And so I've found that in some ways I'm just recreating the very normal like moment of silence, respectful ritual that most of us are familiar with, which is when there is some kind of tragedy, you just become still. And that stillness is a moment of reflection and respect. And it's such a beautiful ritual. And it really lets you pause so that you can remember what matters through that tragedy. And in some ways, I think that is the most positive thing that can come out of tragedy, is that despite it being a tragedy, those are often the things that remind us about what matters most. And yes, we want to debate the causes and we want to point out how we think tragedies could have been prevented or better handled or whatever it is, but not at the expense of recognizing the most fundamental lesson in these tragedies, which is that life is incredibly fragile, and we shouldn't put ourselves into positions where we are so avoidant of that fact that we end up lashing out at people who themselves may be impacted by that tragedy more than you are, because we are so upset and just looking for an outlet so that we don't deal with the really uncomfortable reality that there by the grace of God go you. I'm not a religious person, but that's one of my favorite religious phrases because it encapsulates the kind of grace and humility that I think social media culture, I think I want to call it that. I think we have a social media culture. I think that's a thing that social media culture inculcates in us, where when tragedy happens, the first thing we do is run to debate it and to give our take and to promote the viewpoint we were just tweeting about yesterday, and now be like, actually, this is somehow relevant to this thing. And it's, okay, yeah, amazing how everything links back to your cause. Instead of doing that, tragedy deserves respect. It deserves stillness. And in some ways, I find that that is the best silver lining that can come out of tragedy, is that it reminds us to treat each other well. And I know that this is so, like, all this stuff sounds so woo, but that's really what matters so much more than bullying someone because they didn't say that climate change is the only reason for this natural disaster, or attacking someone because you think it's wrong that they have more money and can pay for private firefighters, while they end up losing their house anyway. I don't think that makes the world a better place. I don't think that does anything to mitigate tragedies. I think that makes hard things much worse. And I think that if we give ourselves the time to grieve tragedies, that pause, that intentional pause where we think, this is just sad. Let it just be sad. Let me just be sad, without intellectualizing this and turning it into some like hot take. It makes us more human, and it makes us thus more able to be supportive and constructive in tragedies. And thus, I tell you that we are all not grieving enough. I think we need to grieve more. I think we need just a little more time spent reflecting on the fragility of life, and taking that time to just be sad about it. It's part of life. And this is something that I find very distasteful about the kind of like instant online commentary around every tragedy, is that it lets us ignore the most important silver lining that we can learn from tragedy, which is that life is really short, life is very hard, and the best thing you can do is treat the people around you well. And if you lose sight of that to make a hot take, you've lost the plot of life. So take your time to grieve the world's many sad events, and I will leave you there. So make sure that you subscribe to The Black Sheep. Go to wetheblacksheep.com. You can find all my other live streams. You can find my good news roundups, other explanations of Black Sheep psychology and research papers, very cool stuff. And you will get updated on the next time that I am going live so that you don't miss it. And thank you for joining, and I will see you on the next one.